He doesn't belong here, Preston hissed, slamming the wine list shut just inches from Shaquille's face. Crystal glasses clinked with the sudden jolt. Diners glanced nervously, and the soft jazz playing overhead faltered under the rising tension. Shaq, calm and towering, simply looked up. No anger, no protest. But Mrs. Randall, watching from 2 tables away, couldn't stay silent. Her voice cracked through the room like a whip. That man deserves more respect than you'll ever understand. The restaurant froze, then a twist. Preston's smirk faded as whispers spread. Wait, isn't that his restaurant? If that moment shook something in, you don't scroll. Stay. This story isn't just about dinner. It's about dignity. On a breezy fall evening in Savannah, Georgia, the streets glowed under the amber cast of vintage street lamps. Cobblestone sidewalks echoed softly beneath the heels of well-dressed patrons as they made their way into one of the city's finest establishments, the Ember Room. Known for its meticulously curated wine list, whisper-quiet ambiance, and velvet-draped interiors, it was a place where reservations were made months in advance and where appearances whispered class louder than words ever could. A black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the curb. Its back door opened slowly, revealing a towering man clad in dark jeans, a gray hoodie, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. The valet instinctively stepped forward, but then hesitated, caught off guard by the sight of the man's sheer size. The man gave a warm nod and handed over the keys with a soft, "Appreciate it, big man." It was Shaquille O'Neal. Yes, that Shaq. But tonight, there was no entourage, no cameras, no flashy watches or designer suits. Just Shaq, alone, blending in with the evening crowd, almost as if he didn't want to be recognized. He stepped onto the sidewalk, pulling his hood slightly lower. Despite his efforts to appear ordinary, his 7-foot frame and unmistakable presence still turned heads. But most passers-by, caught in their own glamorous evening plans, simply stared for a moment before looking away, unsure if what they saw was real. Shaq reached for the ornate brass door handle and opened it gently. The Ember Room was dimly lit, bathed in a golden hue from cascading chandeliers. Inside, classical jazz hummed softly in the background. Wine glasses clinked, and soft murmurs of refined conversations danced between tables adorned with white linen and flickering candlelight. He stepped inside his shoulders, slightly hunched, head low, as if trying to shrink his massive frame. The hostess stand stood front and center, polished to a gleam. Behind it, Preston, a sharply dressed waiter in his early 30s, tall and slim, with slicked back hair, and a jawline as sharp as his tone, looked up. Preston had just finished confirming a reservation for a couple arriving from Charleston when he noticed Shaq. His eyes scanned the man's worn hoodie and casual shoes. His brow furrowed. Shaq approached with a quiet confidence, his voice smooth and warm. "Good evening. I was wondering if you might have a table for one." Preston gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Walk-ins aren't common here, sir," he said, enunciating "sir" with a tone that suggested anything but respect. "Do you have a reservation?" Shaq shook his head gently. "Just in town for the night. Thought I'd give this place a try." Preston's eyes flicked down to the sneakers, then to the hoodie. His nostrils flared ever so slightly. "This is the Ember Room," he replied, as if the name itself was explanation enough. We have a strict dress code. Most of our guests come in formal attire. Shaq smiled faintly undeterred. I understand. I'll keep it quiet and short. Just looking to have a peaceful dinner. Preston hesitated, then glanced at the older maitre d' in the corner, who was tending to another group. With no higher authority immediately available, he sighed. Fine, he said briskly. I'll find you a table. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed a menu and turned on his heel, walking briskly into the dining area. Shaq followed every step, drawing eyes. Diners looked up their expressions, mixed some curious others, whispering already. Some, no doubt, were already recognizing him. But dressed the way he was, with no announcement or bravado, many simply assumed he was someone out of place. Preston led Shaq past the heart of the restaurant, bypassing open tables, closer to the fireplace and the soft music. Instead, he veered toward the back, near the kitchen doors, where waitstaff bustled in and out, and the scent of seared steaks and garlic butter occasionally broke through the calm atmosphere. He stopped abruptly at a small two-top tucked against a wall. Here you go, he said, placing the menu down a bit too firmly. Enjoy your dinner. Shaq nodded, unfazed. Thanks. As Preston walked away, he didn't notice the quiet murmurs stirring around him. At a nearby booth, a middle-aged couple exchanged glances. The woman leaned over, whispering, "Isn't that?" The man nodded, replying, "It is." But why would he be back there? Shaq took his seat, slowly folding his massive frame into the delicate chair with surprising grace. He adjusted his silverware, glanced around, and settled in, as if he belonged there all along. From across the room, an elderly woman, Mrs. Randall, who had been coming to the Ember Room every Thursday for the last decade, sipped her tea and watched the scene unfold. She didn't speak, but her gaze lingered on Shaq. She'd seen enough in her life to recognize when something wasn't right. Behind the scenes, Preston returned to the hostess stand and began whispering to Carlos, a junior waiter new to the team. "You see the guy I just seated by the kitchen?" he asked with a smirk. "Came in looking like he got lost on his way to a basketball court. Probably just wants to see if he can say he ate here." Carlos shifted uncomfortably. "But isn't that Shaquille O'Neal?" Preston scoffed. "Even if it is, we treat everyone the same here. And if you don't come dressed right, you don't get treated right. Simple as that." Back at his table, Shaq browsed the menu without urgency. He didn't need this place. He wasn't hungry for validation. He came for something else. A reminder, a test. And the test had already begun. The subtle sounds of silverware and muted conversation continued to float through the Ember Room. But at one corner table near the kitchen doors, the tension had begun to shift. Shaquille O'Neal, seated quietly in his hoodie, and jeans remained an immovable presence, but around him, the ripple effects of his arrival were starting to thicken the air. From the hostess stand, Preston kept glancing in Shaq's direction, annoyed by the lack of discomfort on his guest's face. He had expected resistance, maybe even a complaint. Instead, Shaq looked completely at ease. He was calmly reading the menu, his fingers tracing over the descriptions of dishes with the focus of a man taking his time, not someone pretending to belong. Preston, visibly annoyed, approached Carlos, who was setting glasses on a nearby table. "Watch this," he muttered under his breath. He picked up another menu, one embossed with gold leaf on its edges, reserved for the premium wine pairings and rare chef specials, and walked toward Shaq's table with exaggerated precision. He placed the menu down in front of him with a saccharine smile stretched too tight. "Would you like me to explain anything?" The prices maybe, he asked, tone-clipped and condescending. "Our chef's Wagyu filet with white truffle just runs at $4.50. That's before wine pairings." Shaq looked up, his expression unreadable. There was no sign of annoyance, only curiosity. "I'll try it," he said casually. "And bring me a glass of the AO8 Napa Reserve." Preston's smile faltered for the briefest second before snapping back into place. "Of course," he said, voice honeyed but sharp underneath. "I'll put that in. Do let me know if anything seems unfamiliar." He walked away with a flick of his wrist, hoping the insult had landed. At a table not far from Shaq's missus, Randall, the elderly regular, narrowed her eyes. She'd seen enough to know that something was wrong. She leaned toward her granddaughter, a soft-spoken teacher named Kate, and whispered, "That young man is about to learn a lesson in humility, whether he wants it or not." Shaq remained still, nodding slightly to the jazz trio that had just finished a soft rendition of Autumn Leaves. He clapped twice low and respectful. The musicians gave a small bow, visibly pleased. In the meantime, Preston returned to the bar and leaned over to Carlos again. "You believe that he just picked the most expensive thing on the menu like it's McDonald's. I swear, guys like that only order big to save face. He won't last past the appetizer." Carlos said nothing, but his face betrayed unease. "Maybe he's just hungry," he mumbled. Preston rolled his eyes, hungry for attention. While Shaq waited, the treatment worsened. Water arrived late. Bread never came. While other tables received charming visits from Preston, or even complimentary amuse-bouches from the chef, Shaq sat untouched, forgotten on purpose. His steak arrived 20 minutes late, plated beautifully, but without the usual flourish. Preston didn't bother explaining the dish or asking if everything was to his liking. "Hope that meets your expectations," he said, with a smirk, placing the plate down hard enough for the utensils to rattle. "Looks great," Shaq replied, his voice still calm. Diners began to notice. A lawyer named Gerald, seated with his partner across the room, raised an eyebrow. "That guy's getting treated like he wandered in off the street," he muttered. His partner Clarissa glanced over. "I think that is Shaquille O'Neal." Gerald paused, the realization dawning on him. "No kidding. And they're putting him by the kitchen back near the entrance." The maître d' Thomas had returned from his break and was catching up on the seating chart. "Who's at table 28? He asked. Carlos hesitated. "A walk-in," he said quickly. Preston seated him. Thomas frowned. "That's usually for VIP reservations." Preston didn't think he fit the scene, Carlos added reluctantly. Thomas turned his gaze toward the table in question and narrowed his eyes. Though he wasn't close enough to see clearly, something about the man's stature looked familiar. But before he could get a closer look, Preston reappeared at the bar, laughing under his breath. I give him 10 more minutes before he asks for the check and disappears. As Preston sauntered past Shaq's table again, he called over his shoulder, "Let me know if you need anything else. I'll be with the real guests." Several heads turned. It was loud enough for nearby diners to hear, and even some staff nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Shaq, however, didn't flinch. He cut into the steak with slow, deliberate care, each motion precise. His focus remained on the meal before him. not the barbs around him. Back in the kitchen, the executive chef, Marcus, had just plated a dish for the mayor's party when one of the junior sous chefs came in whispering, "Chef, you know table 28? That's Shaquille O'Neal." Marcus froze. "The basketball player?" "Yes, chef. He's been there almost an hour. No VIP treatment, nothing." Marcus pushed past the kitchen doors, scanned the dining room, and caught sight of Shaq, seated humbly in the back corner. His heart sank. Preston was at the center of it. That much was clear. At her table, Mrs. Randall folded her hands, voice low and heavy. "He's not here to prove himself," she said to Kate. "He's here to remind people that you never know who you're talking to, and that grace doesn't always wear a suit." Shaq sat quietly finishing his meal. His presence hadn't faded, it had grown. He was the quiet center of gravity in a room that was slowly waking up to its own discomfort. And Preston, still caught in his assumption, was walking straight into a moment he could never undo. The Ember Room had grown unusually quiet for a Friday evening. It wasn't the music. Jazz still drifted softly from the trio near the bar, and conversations still hummed. But beneath it all, there was a different kind of stillness. The kind that came not from silence, but from attention. Eyes were shifting. Whispers were rising. Something was off, and everyone felt it, though few could yet name it. At the far corner table near the kitchen, Shaquille O'Neal sat calmly. His posture hadn't changed, nor had the quiet serenity in his face. He ate at a deliberate pace, seemingly unbothered by the mounting tension around him. But the longer he stayed silent, the more his silence became the loudest thing in the room. Preston, the waiter who had seated him with mock politeness and carried out a series of calculated slights, had returned to his other tables with exaggerated warmth. His voice grew louder with every laugh, every flourish of service, each act seemingly performed not just for his guests, but for Shaq to see what he was being denied. But Shaq never looked up. That more than any outburst cut deeper. His silence wasn't weakness. It was power. His refusal to engage in Preston's theater created a mirror, forcing others to see the imbalance more clearly. It wasn't just about steak or service. It was about principle. And it had begun to gnaw at the atmosphere. At a table along the wall, Gerald and Clarissa had grown visibly uncomfortable. Clarissa stirred her drink with a slow, irritated motion. "Why hasn't anyone stepped in?" she asked, eyes flicking to the maitre d'. "That server's been rude all night. And he's not even hiding it." Gerald replied under his breath, "I think they think he won't say anything. That maybe he's just used to it." Clarissa's face tightened. "That's even worse." Back near the kitchen, Thomas, the maitre d', had finally confirmed with the kitchen staff what his instincts had whispered to him earlier. It really was Shaquille O'Neal, sitting at table 28. Not a look-alike. Not someone trying to play a joke. The man himself. He paled. The implications were immediate and chilling. Not just because they had mistreated a celebrity, but because of what that treatment revealed. Thomas moved toward the manager's office, his shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. Inside, he found Elaine Harlow, the Ember Room's general manager, reviewing schedules. "We've got a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Another reservation mishap, number table 28. That's Shaquille O'Neal. Preston's been treating him like trash for the last hour." Elaine's face darkened. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She knew Preston, knew the reputation he had built among staff, and how he treated certain guests when he thought no one of importance was watching. "What's he done?" she asked. "Everything short of throwing him out. No bread, no proper greeting, seated by the kitchen. Sarcastic comments, loud ones." Elaine stood slowly. "And Shaq. He hasn't said a word." Elaine's breath caught. She'd dealt with complaints before. Loud, defensive, accusatory. But a man like Shaquille O'Neal, silent under this kind of treatment, posed a different kind of risk. Not to reputation, but to conscience. Back out on the floor, Mrs. Randall had also had enough. She signaled Thomas quietly, and when he approached, leaned in. "Son, you may want to do something before this turns into a lesson in humility, one this place may not recover from." Thomas nodded. "We're on it." Meanwhile, Preston returned to the bar, still smug. He's probably halfway through, and already counting his change. He joked, though his voice lacked the glee it had earlier. Shaq's silence was bothering him. It unsettled his rhythm. Preston was used to pushing buttons, but this time, nothing pushed back. That kind of calm couldn't be faked, and it left him exposed. Shaq, for his part, sipped his water eyes, scanning the intricate paintings on the walls. He looked around, not with scorn, but with something gentler, something reflective. To anyone watching closely, he seemed not only at peace, but quietly in control. Carlos, the junior waiter, passed nearby and caught Shaq's eye. Shaq nodded once a silent acknowledgement. Carlos paused, then took a deep breath and walked toward the bar. "Preston," he said quietly but firmly, "you need to stop." Preston sneered. "Excuse me, you're humiliating him. And yourself." Preston scoffed. "You don't even know who he is." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Don't I?" And before Preston could respond, Elaine entered the dining room. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation marks. Every head turned. She walked directly to Shaq's table, stopping short with a slight bow of the head. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, voice low and respectful, "please accept my deepest apologies." Shaq looked up, smiled. "It's okay," he said, calm as ever. "I'm just here for dinner," I know, Elaine replied. "But you deserve better." "Everyone does." The room, once buzzing with background chatter, now teetered in near silence. At the bar, Preston froze. Realization had finally cracked through his arrogance. Elaine turned. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. "Preston," she said evenly, "my office. Now." As he stepped away, guests began to murmur, some in shame, others in admiration. Mrs. Randall smiled, raising her wine glass. "Told you," she said to Kate. "Some people don't need to raise their voice to speak the loudest." In the center of it all, Shaq remained still. Not because he needed power or control or revenge, but because silence wielded with purpose had already done everything words could not. Shaquille O'Neal rose slowly from his seat, the ambient jazz momentarily quieting in deference to his looming figure. His voice, however, was calm, measured with the weight of years shaped by patience. "I came here tonight, not as Shaq, not as a celebrity or an owner." He began fixing his gaze on Preston, who stood frozen in place. Just as a man wanting to share a quiet meal. His eyes, warm but resolute, met Preston's, and silence fell over the room like a held breath. Angela, head manager, hovered nearby, both eager and anxious. She had already taken steps toward damage control, but Shaq's presence demanded more. He continued, "But what happened out there shouldn't happen to anyone famous or not. It's not about me. It's about how people are treated when no one sees, when they're dismissed before anyone knows who they are." Preston's shoulders sagged a tremor in his posture, betraying the unraveling facade of confidence. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected. There were no headline-chasing accusations, no demand for public shaming, only a quiet, grounded expectation of accountability. Shaq turned to the staff gathered around. "Every one of you sets the tone for what it means to come here. People won't remember the plating or the price. They'll remember how they felt." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Carlos, the junior waiter, who had tried to intervene earlier, nodded slowly, relief and remorse mixing in his expression. He had finally been granted confirmation of his suspicions. Shaq was not just any guest. And yet Shaq didn't dwell on that, didn't flaunt it. Instead, he asked, "Let's make sure everyone leaves here feeling seen." The words echoed with unexpected clarity, challenging each staff member to scrutinize their behavior from that moment forward. Shaq didn't frame it as a reprimand, but a better way forward. Across the room, Mrs. Randall clasped her hands together. She'd come to expect civility here. This moment felt like validation of her quiet discomfort, of the instinct that something needed to change. The couple next to her, the Davises, exchanged glances, impressed not only by the humility Shaq displayed, but by the sense of leadership that didn't demand deference. Angela stepped forward, the color of embarrassment still flushed in her cheeks. "Mr. O'Neill, on behalf of the Ember Room, I offer my deepest apologies. That was unacceptable, and it is not the standard we stand for." Shaq turned to her and nodded. "Thank you. But let's go further than that. I believe in second chances, but they need to come with real change." He smiled gently, just enough to encourage rather than dominate. Preston has potential. He just needs to learn what it means to see people, each one who walks through that door. Preston met Shaq's calm gaze. Words caught in his throat, but the apology came voice small and broken. I'm sorry. I judged you by your clothes. I was wrong." He looked toward the staff, eyes brimming. "I see it now. I'm sorry." At that moment, Lisa, who had discreetly filmed Shaq's earlier restraint, and now this moment felt a swell of admiration. Her social media post would later ignite a wave of praise for Shaq's dignity and willingness to teach rather than punish. Shaq took a step toward the rest of the team, placing a hand on the countertop. This isn't just about PR or image. It's about what we stand for. Ember Room can be known not just for elegance, but kindness. Let me help after your shift. Let's talk. Let me share what I've learned on the court, off it, and in life. Let's make this place reflect that. Silence rippled across the staff. Some had tears in their eyes. Others nodded in agreement. This was more than a celebrity moment. This was a lesson in humility and leadership that would shape the Ember Room's future. As Shaq sat down again, the room exhaled. It was as if a collective weight had lifted. Plates that had seemed secondary took on new meaning. Conversations that had felt hollow now carried sincerity. And Shaq's demeanor, steady kind, quietly commanding, left an impression that was far more enduring than any accolade. He picked up his water glass and took a measured sip. "Thank you," he said simply, not to any one person, but to everyone's staff diners, the place itself. It was a moment of grace and accountability that spoke far louder than fame ever could. That final dinner at the Ember Room wasn't just a meal, it was the start of something greater. When Shaquille O'Neal walked into the dimly lit dining room, hours after the last guests had left, the air felt different. It wasn't the hush of solitude that usually follows closing time. Instead, there was an undercurrent of quiet anticipation. Staff members, Angela, Carlos, even Preston, stood or sat in muted groups, their faces thoughtful, some lined with regret, others with hopeful expectation. Shaq made his way to the center of the space framed by the soft glow of chandelier light and the remnants of a night transformed. He looked around at the faces young servers experienced, line cooks, bar staff, who'd seen it all, and offered a gentle nod. This wasn't a reprimand. It was a gesture of unity. They gathered in a loose circle, not as higher-ups or subordinates, but as people aligned by purpose. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "I know this has been a difficult night," he began. Not a patron demanding justice, but a man quietly inviting growth. Mistakes were made not just because of what was said or done, but because of what we assumed. Assumptions based on appearance, on attitude, on habit. That's something we need to change. Angela, whose shoulders had carried the weight of the restaurant's reputation, looked at Shaq with gratitude. Her smile was small but steady. Preston stood near her face, still drawn with guilt. Carlos, always the empath, stood a little apart, listening as if every syllable was new wisdom. Shaq continued, "I've been underestimated before," he admitted. "On the court in business, every time someone thought my size or my manner meant something about who I was. But I've learned that humility, calmness, respect, those are the signs of real strength. That's why I'm here with you tonight. Because leadership begins with service, not applause." He walked slowly toward Preston, who looked away uncertain. Shaq laid a hand on his shoulder. "You've got character, kid," he said softly. "You just need to widen your vision. Treat everyone who walks through this door as someone worthy, not because of who they are, but because of who they could be." There was a pause, and then Preston swallowed. I get it now," he said, voice thick. "I let my own fears and biases lead me. I'm sorry to you and to everyone here." Carlos stepped forward. "Me too," he said. "I sat back when I knew better." Shaq nodded. "That's the first step. Accountability doesn't erase errors. It builds momentum." Angela cleared her throat, voice steady. "Going forward, we're committed to more than just good food. We want to nourish respect. We will institute training not as a burden, but as a foundational value. And Preston, Carlos, everyone, this starts tonight." Shaq's expression softened, as though he felt the weight of their commitment. "That's why I'm not just here for the night. Let's meet regularly. Let me share with you how coaches I respected led me through adversity, how other stars stay humble under pressure, how to build a culture where nobody leaves feeling less than they are." A quiet agreement passed among them. It wasn't about being forgiven, they already were, but about becoming better. Preston nodded, even managed a small smile. Angels in the room seemed to shift from flickers of shame to flickers of pride. There was something healing in the gathering, the spark of transformation. Later, as they scattered to their closing tasks, the energy had changed. Preston lingered near the front desk. He pulled out a small chalkboard and wrote, "Welcome all," no matter how you arrive. Then he placed it where anyone walking in would see it first. Angela joined him. "I've called some partners," she said. "We'll fund workshops on service equity, and we'll hire more diverse staff to reflect who we are." Carlos in the kitchen placed a handwritten note near the chef's station. "Tonight reminded me cooking isn't just feeding, it's honoring." Word left the restaurant and grew. The Savannah Evening Chronicle ran a story framed not as a scandal, but as redemption. Legendary player teaches high-end staff a lesson in kindness. The headline captured the public's attention, not because of the mistake, but because of the grace shown afterward. On social media, the influencer Lisa's footage trended overnight. Comments poured in. "That's how you use star power. More restaurants could use this lesson." Shaq wins on and off the court. The conversation shifted from a snarky insult to a story about leadership forgiveness and humanizing service. Preston carefully read through local reviews the next morning. One review from a new regular opened, came for the steak, stayed for the heart. He exhaled, a weight lifted. This was the redemption he hadn't thought possible. Shaq returned to the Ember Room a week later. The entrance felt different, warmer. The staff greeted him by name. At his reserved table by the fireplace, this time, not near the kitchen, Angela personally brought him a complimentary appetizer, not as an obligation, but as a gesture of respect regained. He smiled and nodded. Carlos brought the wine. Preston, standing beside them, met his gaze and offered a genuine, almost shy nod of greeting. He knew he'd changed. They all had. And the Ember Room was becoming more than a restaurant. It was becoming a place where respect and redemption was part of the menu. Shaq lifted his glass to the group. "To new standards," he said softly. Voice, warm eyes, bright. Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was shared. In the end, it wasn't the steak or the wine that people remembered. It wasn't even the quiet whispers of "Isn't that Shaquille O'Neal?" or the cameras that discreetly flickered from phones. It was the stillness, the dignity that hung in the air long after the final dish had been cleared. A night that began with condescension and cold glares ended with transformation, redemption, and the kind of grace that can't be taught in a hospitality handbook. Shaquille never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Where others might have stormed out, called for boycotts, or demanded heads to roll, he stayed. He stayed long enough for people to face themselves, to hear the echo of their own biases, to feel the discomfort they so often ignore. And when he finally did speak, it wasn't to shame, but to lift. To invite everyone, especially Preston, to a higher standard. Preston. Once the smirking face of silent prejudice became something else entirely, a man cracked open by truth, humility seeping into places arrogance had sealed shut. He apologized not just with words, but with actions. He listened. He learned. And more importantly, he began to change. Carlos found his voice that night. No longer the quiet bystander, he became part of a new culture at the Ember Room, one that valued respect over status intention, over assumption. The quietest staff member became a leader in accountability. It wasn't dramatic, it was human. And that made all the difference. Angela rewrote the staff handbook. Training sessions went beyond customer service scripts and dove deep into empathy, inclusion, and grace under pressure. Weekly meetings included real conversations about how to create safe, welcoming experiences, not just for the wealthy or well known, but for anyone who walked through their doors. The Ember Room became a place of education as much as indulgence, where the standard of excellence wasn't just about fine dining, but about how people felt when they left. And the Ember Room. It evolved. Guests returned not for the Wagyu or the vintage reds, but for the spirit of the place. They came because word had spread not just of a celebrity's visit, but of a cultural shift that had made its way into every greeting, every pour, every plate. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a mirror held up to a society in need of reflection. A place where the food fed your body and the environment reminded you of your worth. Shaq returned often, sometimes in plain clothes, sometimes in a suit. He always sat at the same table, no longer near the kitchen, but by the fireplace, where warmth met intention. And every time he was treated the same as everyone else, not because of who he was, but because the Ember Room had decided to become something better. There was no performance, no special attention, just mutual respect quietly shared between human beings. And that's what this story is really about. It's not just about a famous man who was disrespected. It's not just about a waiter who judged too quickly or a restaurant caught off guard. It's about what happens when we're faced with our own blind spots and we choose to see. It's about ordinary moments with extraordinary impact. The kind of quiet courage it takes to let yourself be wrong, and the even greater courage to change because of it. It's about the power of silence when used with purpose. The courage to stay in the room when you have every reason to leave. The strength it takes to lead with humility instead of ego. And the transformation that becomes possible when we move beyond punishment and toward growth. A transformation that can ripple far beyond one dining room. This story reminds us that grace isn't weakness, accountability isn't cruelty, and redemption isn't reserved for saints. It's available to all of us if we're willing to be honest with ourselves. Growth isn't just possible, it's necessary. And sometimes it starts at a table with a stranger who chooses to stay. So, what can we take from all of this? Maybe it's this. When you walk into a room, look a little deeper. The man in the hoodie might be the owner. The quiet guest might be a giant. The person you're tempted to overlook might be the one who changes everything. We don't always recognize greatness when it enters softly, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. In your workplace, in your family, in your community, lead with respect before reputation. Offer patience before judgment. And when you mess up, because we all do, let your apology be the beginning of your transformation, not just a performance. Let your silence, when chosen, be powerful. Let your voice, when used, be kind. Think about the places in your life where unconscious assumptions may have shaped your actions. Ask yourself, who have I treated differently because of how they looked, dressed, or spoke? And more importantly, what kind of world am I helping to build with those choices? Because at the end of the day, the world changes not through grand gestures or viral moments, but through small, consistent acts of integrity. Through holding the door for someone who feels invisible. Through standing up when staying silent is easier. Through recognizing that the smallest dignity you offer might be someone else's turning point. So, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you overlooked, or someone who lifted you when no one else would share it, let it sit with you. Let it challenge you. Talk about it with someone. Let it be the beginning of something, not just for the people in this story, but for you too. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories of courage, redemption, and the quiet power of doing what's right, then please consider supporting this channel. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, tell us how this story made you feel, what it made you remember, or what it pushed you to reconsider. Because this isn't just our story, it's yours too. And we're just getting started.